Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for watching this presentation. I'm going to talk about the interpersonal normativity in collective action. In particular, I'm going to make some claims about the nature of collective action, what it is exactly, and what grounds the directed obligations that are part of it. Two things appear to be distinctive about collective action. One is that it involves a special structure of interrelated psychological attitudes between the participants, guiding them towards the achievement of a goal. The other is that it involves a special status between the participants, allowing them to negotiate, criticize, hold accountable, demand answers, and encourage in ways not licensed for third parties. The first is about the mechanism that allows us to coordinate our behavior in order to execute our plans. The second is about the social relationship that exists between us when we do. Philosophical reflection on collective action has been divided between those who focus on the first and those who focus on the second. Explaining the first characteristic often leads to an emphasis on collective intention by way of engagement with the philosophy of action in the individual case. Focusing on the second, often in pursuit of uncovering foundations for social or moral theory, in turn leads to an emphasis on the nature and source of the relational normativity in interpersonal interactions. The aims of this talk incorporate both elements, although my focus is on the second. My first aim is to suggest a synthesis between understanding collective action as the result of a particular psychological structure and understanding collective action as a kind of social relationship. But this aim is subservient to my second, which is to explore a possible account of the ground of interpersonal obligation in the social relationship. I'll take these aims in reverse order, starting with the second, and returning to the first towards the end of the talk. Many think that collective actions involve interpersonal obligations. Examples include Margaret Gilbert, Abraham Roth, and Facundo Alonso. Recent experimental research I've done in tandem with Javier Gomez-Lavin corroborates the general claim. But there's much dispute about what the contents of these obligations are and what they're grounded in. Some argue that there is an obligation to inform others about changes in one's plans generated by the creation of expectations in our co-participants and our informational interests. Others argue that there is an obligation to do one's part, grounded in the relation between the participatory intentions of the co-actors. And some claim that there is an obligation to receive the concurrence of the other parties before leaving, grounded in the jointness of the commitment made by the participants. However, none of these views captures the specific obligations attested to in the empirical research. Briefly, the experimental research suggests that when two people are acting together, in minimal cases that do not involve explicit agreements or promises, nor any indication of particular harms or losses resulting from nonconformity, they have an obligation to notify other participants before leaving, but they do not have an obligation to seek the concurrence of others. And the same package of interpersonal normativity is also present when people are doing something morally wrong, at least in the judgments of the participants in our studies. This conflicts with received views in the following ways. Grounding these interpersonal obligations in expectations and informational interests makes it difficult to account for immoral cases and cases that do not involve reliance losses. Grounding these interpersonal obligations in the relation between our participatory intentions makes it difficult to account for the obligation to notify. And grounding these obligations in joint commitments makes it difficult to explain the lack of an obligation to receive concurrence before leaving. Now, it's certainly not the case that experimental research is conclusive on this issue, nor could such research provide the justification for any kind of normative judgment. But insofar as these philosophical accounts are meant to capture something about human practices, our results do suggest that further normative theorizing is in order. My methodological approach is then to do some normative theorizing and see what claims the experimental research provides support for, with a background assumption that a normative account that justifies practices that are in fact social practices is preferable to one that doesn't, so long as we're in part in the business of making sense of our own normative world. In response to this research and these claims, I'll offer some thoughts about how the normative account could go. The central idea is that the obligations of collective action are grounded in our normative interests, specifically our deontic interest, and as such, collective actions are involvements of a particular kind. These concepts and technical terms are borrowed from the work of David Owens, so I'll start the positive project by explaining the relevant parts of his general view. Owens's big claim is that in addition to our non-normative interests in how things will actually go, that is, in what people actually do or feel, we also have interests in the shape of our normative life itself. In other words, we have interests directly in what it would be appropriate or make sense for people to do or feel, and these interests are in some sense separate from our interest in what is actually going to happen. These are our normative interests. This usage can sometimes be confusing. Take an interest in not being harmed. This is, in Owen's terminology, a non-normative interest, because it concerns what is actually going to happen. But in addition to that interest, I may also have an interest in that harm being a wrong against me, or an interest in someone being blameworthy for committing that harm. And I have this interest whether or not it makes a difference to the likelihood of the harm occurring. That, then, is my normative interest. Owens distinguishes between several different normative interests and uses them to explain a variety of normative phenomena. For example, he argues that our authority interest underlies our practices of promising, and our permissive interest underlies consent. I think that the relevant interest for collective action is our deontic interest, which, Owens claims, is an interest we have in being able to bind ourselves together by choice using interpersonal normativity. That is, it is an interest we have in being able to make certain behaviors wrongings in the context of interpersonal interactions. Deontic interests ground obligations in chosen, valuable social relationships, like friendship, rivalry, acquaintanceship, and I'm right, collective action. Owens calls relationships with these properties involvements. It seems uncontroversial that there are such things. Friendship clearly involves obligations, and our friends can make demands on us that others can't. In breaching these obligations or refusing these demands, we may wrong our friends, where identical behavior with respect to somebody who is not a friend would not wrong her. Further, unlike other obligation-entailing relationships, like membership in a political community or family, we in some sense choose our friends. Finally, friendship is valuable to us, and part of what makes it so is exactly that our friends are connected to us in ways that others aren't. But in order to see how collective action could be an involvement, we'll have to draw some further distinctions. Friendship is a relationship that involves characteristic emotional bonds, like affection. This is clearly not the case for collective actors. So we need to distinguish between involvements based in part on emotional bonds and those which aren't, like perhaps acquaintanceship, which doesn't seem to require any particular emotional connection. But something like acquaintanceship does require repeated interaction over time, and acknowledgement of the acquaintance's particular position in the social world outside of any particular interaction. These two do not seem to be a necessary part of collective action. However, Owens, as part of his discussion of involvements, also briefly considers conversation and refers to the work of Erving Goffman. This is the strand I would like to pick up. Conversational partners do not need to repeatedly interact in the ways characteristic of acquaintanceship, nor do they need to have any particular affection towards one another. So it is clear that while some involvements have these properties, neither is necessary for something to be an involvement. Yet, despite being in some sense thinner, conversation is arguably just as important to human social life. In fact, in the passage of Goffman Owens is building on, Goffman, referring to conversation, says, quote, "It is this spark, not the more obvious kinds of love that lights up the world, unquote. Goffman also suggests that there is something special that, quote, an individual owes the others in their capacity as interactants, regardless of what is owed them in whatever other capacities they participate. And it is this obligation that tells us that, whatever social role the individual plays during a conversational encounter, he will have to fill the role of interactant. And Goffman suggests this special thing each owes the other is to, quote, not only maintain proper involvement himself, but also to act so as to ensure that the others will maintain theirs, unquote. I take this to mean that there are special practices governing conversation in particular, but there are also things we owe each other simply as interactants. My claim, then, is that stripped of any of the particular social practices and norms governing certain collective act types like conversation, what Goffman is pointing to here is the basic obligation involved in something like partnership, where that just means co-actor in a collective action. That there are social practices like this is nicely demonstrated by the empirical research. Participants in our studies judge that when people are acting together, they are obligated to perform various actions for one another, they have rights to intervene with others' actions that they wouldn't normally have, and so on. And intuitively, people regularly remind each other of their partnership, appeal to it in deliberation and negotiation, and criticize one another for their failure to respond appropriately to it. These behavioral dispositions amongst co-actors reflect a particular package of attitudes and norms. This matches nicely with Owens's characterization of involvements, which runs as follows, quote, an involvement is a dynamic syndrome of attitudes, of behavior that expresses or purports to express those attitudes, and of norms that govern both attitudes and behavior. And he suggests that the key signal for certain kinds of involvements is mutual social and cognitive recognition. I take it that the description I have given shows that such a syndrome of attitudes and norms is present in collective action, and that those actions and norms demonstrate mutual social recognition. That there is the requisite mutual cognitive recognition, on the other hand, is presupposed by most theories of collective intention. We thus come to the synthesis. Many theories of collective action posit the existence of participatory intentions on the part of each participant, with the joint activity and the content of that intention, plus some further structure of individual intentions, beliefs, reliance, and so on the intentions, beliefs, reliance, and so on of their co-actors. Such psychological constructions entail mutual cognitive recognition of others, as well as giving them a further special role in one's own attitudes. When you and I have a collective intention on such views, only you and your intention can satisfy the contents of my intentions, beliefs, reliance, and so on, and vice versa. So that you play this special role in my intentions and I do in yours surely goes beyond a minimal sense of mutual cognitive recognition. Saying that we accept such norms and that they are related to a socio-psychological structure does not yet explain why these norms are acceptable, nor how this structure is related to the obligations it triggers. I propose that the justification of such norms may come from their ability to serve our deontic interests, making partnership an inherently valuable social relationship. In general, our lives are enriched by the existence of certain bonds and impoverished when they disappear. The obligations of involvements are grounded in exactly that value. It is thus in serving our deontic interests that such involvements constitute valuable relationships, and so the value derives in part precisely because they entail such obligations. As alluded to above, there are many forms of sociality which serve our deontic interests, each with their own associated attitudes, emotional responses, norms, and triggers that do not centrally or essentially evolve collective intention. and we are socially interdependent in many ways that don't serve our deontic interests. Many cases of coordination involving interdependent intentions, for example, avoiding each other on a crowded sidewalk, serve only our non-normative interests. It's better for us if we don't actually collide. But those forms of interdependence do not serve our normative interests. The interaction doesn't involve the specific mutual and social recognition given by the socio-psychological structure of collective intention, and this makes sense from a normative perspective, since our interaction is too weak, too fleeting to enrich our lives by generating interpersonal obligations. Collective action is therefore special because it draws the connection between serving our non-normative interests in social coordination and creating rich interpersonal relationships that serve our normative interests as well. If we're acting together, my obligations to you are not just valuable because they make my behavior easier to predict, or because you gain protection from some potential loss of time, resources, or energy. They're valuable in part because they serve our interest in being bound together. As an involvement, unlike other ways we generate collective outcomes, collective action is something we value in part because it creates interpersonal obligations between us. What I've said so far constitutes only the first steps on the way to a full account, since it leaves out much that needs to be clarified. Certainly more needs to be said about how we see partnership itself as a valuable social relationship, as well as the specific obligations involved in partnership. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, something needs to be said about how those specific obligations arise from the ground that I've proposed. Nonetheless, I hope to have made it appear at least plausible that this is the right direction. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to corresponding with you in the comments.